Throw her out before the guests begin asking why she still lives here. The sentence drifted through the marble entrance hall with the softness of silk and the cruelty of a blade. Serafina Evercott stood perfectly still at the foot of the staircase, one gloved hand resting against the polished banister, while rain battered the tall windows overlooking the front courtyard. Beyond the glass, carriage lanterns glowed through the storm like distant fires. Inside the Evercott estate, servants moved quickly beneath crystal chandeliers, preparing for the winter reception that would begin in less than an hour. Flowers were being arranged. Silver trays gleamed beneath candlelight. The scent of roses and beeswax floated through the hall in careful layers of wealth. And in the center of it all stood Lenora Evercott in a dark emerald gown, her diamonds flashing coldly as she turned toward the butler without once looking at her stepdaughter. "I will not repeat myself, Morris." Her voice remained calm. That made it worse. "She leaves tonight." Morris hesitated only briefly. He had worked in the house for 22 years. He had watched Serafina grow from a quiet child into a woman who moved through rooms like someone apologizing for taking up space. "Madam," he said carefully, "the storm outside is worsening." Lenora finally looked at Serafina then. Her pale mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Then she should walk faster." The words settled into the room. No servant spoke after that. Serafina lowered her eyes to the black leather gloves in her hands. One seam had begun to loosen near the thumb. She traced it absently with her fingertip. The gesture was small, controlled. It was the only sign that her breathing had changed. At 24, Serafina had mastered stillness the way other women mastered music or embroidery. She knew how to survive conversations by speaking as little as possible. She knew how to disappear during dinners. She knew how to lower her gaze at exactly the right moment so people forgot she was standing there. Those skills had kept peace inside the Evercott household for 12 years. Tonight they failed her anyway. "Surely you understand why this must happen," Lenora continued. "You cannot remain here indefinitely while contributing nothing." Serafina looked toward the grand staircase where portraits of the Evercott family lined the wall in heavy gold frames. Her father's portrait hung near the landing. Edwin Evercott, dark hair already silvering at the temples. Stern eyes softened only slightly by the painter's attempt at warmth. He had been dead for 7 years. The house had become quieter after that. Colder. "I understand," Serafina said. Her voice barely rose above the crackling fire. Lenora studied her with visible irritation, almost disappointed by the lack of resistance. "Do you?" she asked. "Because I do not think you truly appreciate the generosity I have shown you. Most women in my position would have sent you away years ago." Serafina said nothing. She remembered being 14 and standing in this same hall while Lenora informed the servants that meals would no longer be served in the formal dining room for unnecessary members of the household. She remembered 16 and watching her bedroom furniture removed because one of Lenora's visiting cousins required the larger room. She remembered 19 and hearing laughter drift through ballroom doors while she remained upstairs mending torn gloves by candlelight because her stepmother claimed her presence embarrassed the family. The humiliations had never arrived loudly. They arrived softly, repeatedly, like water slowly breaking stone. "Take only what belongs to you," Lenora said, "which should not require much packing." A few servants lowered their eyes. Morris inhaled quietly through his nose as though restraining something he could not afford to say. Serafina reached for the small traveling case beside the staircase. It was already packed. That detail finally caused Lenora's expression to shift. "You expected this?" Serafina adjusted the handle carefully. "I learned not to unpack completely in this house." Silence followed. Brief, heavy. Somewhere deeper inside the estate, musicians began tuning violins for the evening reception. Lenora recovered first. "How dramatic!" Serafina moved toward the door before her hands could begin trembling visibly. The marble floor reflected candlelight beneath her shoes. She counted each step instinctively. 1, 2, 3. Maintain composure until the door closes. That had become another survival skill. Behind her, Lenora spoke again. "Do not attempt to contact the family after tonight." Family. The word almost stopped her. Almost. Serafina rested her hand against the bronze handle. Cold metal pressed against her palm. She could feel dozens of eyes on her now. Servants pretending not to stare. Footmen frozen beside the entrance. A maid near the staircase blinking rapidly as though fighting tears she would never permit herself to shed publicly. Serafina opened the door. Winter wind swept immediately into the hall, carrying rain across the polished floor. The storm outside had swallowed the entire street in darkness and silver mist. Carriages lined the curved driveway ahead of the estate, their wheels splashing through inches of rainwater. Guests would begin arriving soon. Lenora had timed this deliberately. Quiet humiliations were no longer enough. She wanted witnesses. Serafina stepped outside. Rain touched her face instantly. Cold, sharp, awake. Behind her, the enormous doors began closing, then stopped. Not because Lenora called for them to stop, because Morris had suddenly gone still. Serafina followed his line of sight toward the iron gates at the far edge of the property. A black carriage stood motionless beyond the rain, larger than the others, unmarked. The horses did not move. Neither did the driver. For one strange second, the entire courtyard seemed to pause around it. Even through the storm, she could feel attention coming from inside that carriage. Watching, measuring, waiting. "Who is that?" One of the younger maids whispered behind her. No one answered. Then the carriage door opened. A tall man stepped into the rain wearing a long black coat darkened by water at the shoulders. He did not hurry despite the storm. He crossed the courtyard with slow, deliberate steps that carried the kind of confidence no weather could touch. The footmen near the entrance straightened instantly. Morris looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Serafina recognized the man only from a distance. Everyone in London recognized him. Duke Cassian Vailcrest, 34 years old, Duke of Ravensshire, a man society described in lowered voices and unfinished sentences. He rarely attended public gatherings, rarely danced, rarely smiled. Rumors followed him through every ballroom in England anyway. Some called him ruthless. Others called him dangerous. Most simply stepped aside when he entered a room. Rain slid down the sharp line of his jaw as he approached the entrance steps. His expression revealed nothing. Not annoyance. Not curiosity. Certainly not sympathy. He stopped several feet from Serafina. Close enough now for her to notice his eyes. Gray. Precise. The kind of eyes that missed nothing. He looked at the travel case beside her feet first. Then at the half-closed doors behind her. Then finally at Serafina herself. Not quickly. Not carelessly. His gaze lingered just long enough to make the air feel different. She realized suddenly that this was the first time in years someone had looked directly at her instead of through her. Lenora appeared in the doorway behind the servants, recovering her composure almost immediately. "Your Grace," she said smoothly. "What an unexpected honor." Cassian Vailcrest did not look at her. The silence stretched long enough for discomfort to begin spreading visibly through the entrance hall. Rain tapped steadily against stone. Somewhere nearby thunder rolled across the city. Serafina tightened her grip on the handle of her case to stop her fingers from shaking. The Duke's voice, when it finally came, was low and calm. "How long?" he asked, still looking at Serafina. "Has she been treated this way?" Rainwater slid from the brim of the carriage lanterns in slow silver streams while nobody inside the Evercott entrance hall answered the Duke's question. The silence deepened with every passing second. Servants lowered their eyes toward the marble floor. One of the younger footmen swallowed visibly. Lenora Evercott recovered first. She always did. "Your Grace," she said with practiced elegance. "I fear you have arrived in the middle of a private family matter." Cassian Vailcrest remained completely still beneath the rain. Water darkened his black coat at the shoulders, yet he carried himself with the calm indifference of a man who had stopped noticing discomfort years ago. "I did not ask whether it was private." His voice never rose. It did not need to. Serafina watched her stepmother's expression tighten almost imperceptibly. People often mistook Lenora's control for grace. Serafina knew better. The woman's anger always revealed itself first around the mouth. "There has been no mistreatment," Lenora replied smoothly. "Miss Evercott is an adult woman. Certain arrangements can no longer continue indefinitely. Miss Evercott. Not daughter. Never daughter." Cashin finally shifted his gaze toward Lenora. The movement was slight. Somehow it changed the entire courtyard. She leaves tonight. It was not a question. Lenora lifted her chin. That is correct. During a storm. The weather was unfortunate. The Duke's eyes moved briefly toward the open doorway behind Lenora, where warm candlelight spilled across the entrance hall. Music drifted faintly from deeper inside the mansion as servants continued preparing for the evening reception despite the tension gathering at the front steps. Then his gaze returned to Serafina. She stood motionless beside her single traveling case, rain soaking slowly through the sleeves of her dark blue coat. Most women would have pleaded by now. Others would have cried. Serafina did neither. She simply held herself upright with the exhausted dignity of someone too accustomed to humiliation to expect rescue anymore. Cashin noticed the state of her gloves first. One seam near the thumb had begun unraveling, repaired repeatedly, carefully maintained despite age. The observation settled quietly somewhere behind his expressionless face. "How long have you known she would leave tonight?" he asked. The question landed directly on Serafina this time. She hesitated before answering. "Long enough." Her voice remained soft, controlled. Rain touched her eyelashes, but she did not brush it away. Cashin studied her for another moment. There was no self-pity in her face. That interested him more than tears would have. Lenora stepped forward slightly. "Your Grace, I assure you there is no cause for concern. Serafina has been provided for generously over the years. Unfortunately, she lacks the practical qualities necessary for managing a household of this size." Serafina lowered her eyes. Not from shame. From habit. "I see," Cashin said. Nothing in his tone suggested agreement. Behind him, another carriage rolled through the front gates carrying evening guests toward the estate. Lantern light flickered through rain as servants hurried forward with umbrellas. The timing sharpened the humiliation perfectly. Serafina understood suddenly that Lenora had not merely wanted her gone before the reception. She had wanted the guests to witness the aftermath. The disgraced stepdaughter disappearing into the storm while the rest of society stepped inside to dance beneath crystal chandeliers. The realization should have hurt more than it did. Instead, she felt only tired. Deeply tired. "Your Grace," Lenora continued, "surely you did not come here to involve yourself in domestic disagreements." Cashin ignored the question entirely. "Where will you go?" he asked Serafina. She tightened her grip on the handle of her case. "I have not decided yet." "You have nowhere arranged?" "No," the answer came quietly, honest. For the first time that evening, something shifted behind Cashin Veilcrest's eyes. Not pity. Certainly not softness. Recognition, perhaps. As though her answer had confirmed something he already suspected. A gust of cold wind swept across the courtyard, scattering rain against the stone steps. Serafina's loose hair brushed against her cheek. She reached up automatically to smooth it back into place. The movement was small and precise. Another survival habit. Maintain composure first. Feel later. One of the arriving guests paused halfway up the front path after recognizing the Duke standing in the rain. Whispered confusion spread instantly between the servants near the gate. Why was the Duke of Ravensshire standing outside the Evercott estate in the middle of a storm, speaking to the discarded daughter no one in London bothered noticing? Lenora heard the murmurs too. Alarm flickered briefly beneath her composure. "Serafina," she said sharply. "You are keeping his grace in the rain." Serafina inclined her head slightly. "Forgive me." She moved to lift her traveling case. Before she could, Cashin spoke again. "Leave it." She looked up at him. Rain traced slowly down the sharp angle of his cheekbone. "Your Grace." "The case," he repeated calmly. "Leave it where it is." Morris blinked in confusion. Lenora's expression hardened. "I do not understand." "No," Cashin said. "I do not believe you do." The words settled with quiet force between them. Then he turned toward Morris instead of Lenora. "Have my driver place Miss Evercott's belongings in the rear carriage." The butler froze. "Your Grace." Immediately, Serafina stared at him without moving. Surely she had misunderstood. The Duke finally looked directly at her again. His gaze remained unreadable. "You will come with me." The rain seemed suddenly louder against the stone courtyard. Behind the open doors, servants exchanged startled glances. Lenora took an involuntary step forward. "Your Grace, that would be entirely inappropriate." Cashin's attention shifted toward her with terrifying calm. "Then perhaps you should have considered appropriateness before putting a woman onto the street during a winter storm." Lenora opened her mouth, closed it again. For the first time in years, Serafina watched her stepmother lose control of a conversation. The sight felt strange, unreal. "I am certain this misunderstanding can be resolved privately," Lenora said carefully. "Miss Evercott is emotional this evening." Serafina almost smiled at that. Almost. She had not raised her voice once. Cashin noticed the flicker of expression anyway. "Does she often become emotional in complete silence?" Lenora's face paled slightly. One of the nearby maids looked down quickly to hide what might have become a smile. The Duke stepped closer then. Not enough to invade Serafina's space. Just enough for his voice to lower beneath the rain. "Miss Evercott." She met his eyes cautiously. "Do you wish to remain here?" The question caught her unprepared. Not because of the words themselves. Because no one had asked what she wished in a very long time. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. She forced herself to answer steadily. "No." Cashin gave a single nod, as though confirming the final detail of a private calculation. "Then there is nothing more to discuss." He turned toward the waiting carriage. Morris moved automatically to retrieve Serafina's travel case before the younger footman could reach it first. The old butler's hands trembled slightly around the handle. As he passed beside her, he lowered his voice enough that only she could hear. "I am sorry, Miss Serafina." She looked at him then. Really looked at him. The man who had secretly sent extra blankets to her room during harsh winters. The man who always placed books aside for her before Lenora could donate them away. The closest thing to kindness this house had offered her in years. "Thank you," she whispered. Morris bowed his head quickly and carried the case toward the Duke's carriage before emotion could fully betray him. Serafina remained motionless at the bottom of the steps while rain gathered along her collar and sleeves. Guests continued arriving behind the gates now. More lanterns. More voices. More witnesses. She could already feel tomorrow's gossip spreading through drawing rooms across London. The discarded Evercott girl leaving her family home in the Duke of Ravenshire's carriage. Lenora stood frozen in the doorway, watching the scene unravel beyond her control. Cashin paused beside the open carriage door and glanced back once toward Serafina. "Miss Evercott." His tone remained calm. "You are getting cold." Such a simple sentence. Nothing sentimental. Nothing intimate. Yet something inside her chest tightened painfully anyway because nobody had noticed her discomfort in years. Serafina descended the final step through the rain and crossed the courtyard toward the waiting carriage, while the entire Evercott household watched in stunned silence. And somewhere behind her, hidden beneath the sound of the storm, Lenora Evercott finally began to understand that throwing Serafina away might prove to be the most dangerous mistake she had ever made. The carriage door closed softly behind Serafina, shutting out the rain, the Evercott estate, and the stunned silence lingering across the courtyard. For several seconds she did not move. She sat with both hands folded tightly in her lap while the interior lantern swayed gently above her head, casting warm gold light across dark velvet seats and polished walnut panels. Outside, wheels rolled slowly over wet stone as the carriage pulled away from the estate. No one spoke. Duke Cashin Valecrest sat opposite her with the same unnerving stillness he carried everywhere else. One gloved hand rested against the silver head of his cane, though he did not appear to need it for support. Rainwater still darkened portions of his coat, but he seemed entirely unaffected by discomfort. Serafina kept her eyes lowered toward the leather gloves in her lap. She had spent years learning how to survive enclosed spaces with powerful people. Speak carefully. Move carefully. Reveal nothing unnecessary. Yet none of those instincts explained why the Duke of Ravensshire had intervened tonight. The question pressed quietly against her thoughts while the carriage moved through rain-soaked London streets. Finally Cashin spoke. "You are cold." She looked up instinctively. He had not phrased it as concern. Simply observation. "I am all right." No, his tone remained calm. "You are trying very hard to appear all right." The words settled uncomfortably inside the silence between them. Serafina lowered her eyes again because the statement was too accurate. Outside the carriage windows, gas lamps blurred through falling rain like streaks of gold paint across black glass. She became aware suddenly of how exhausted her body felt. Not dramatic exhaustion, not collapse, just a deep heaviness beneath her ribs that had been building quietly for years. "Where are we going?" she asked at last. "Ravensshire House." The answer came without hesitation. Serafina's fingers tightened slightly together. Ravensshire House stood among the most powerful estates in London. Even people who had never seen it knew its reputation. Political dinners, royal guests, men with titles and dangerous influence entering through its doors at all hours of the night. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I do not believe that is appropriate." Cashin regarded her for a moment beneath the dim carriage light. "You believe remaining on the street during a winter storm would be more appropriate? That is not what I meant." "I know." Silence returned. The carriage wheels rolled steadily through puddles outside. Serafina watched his reflection flicker faintly against the darkened window. There was something unsettling about him. Not cruelty exactly. Precision. The feeling that every movement and every sentence had already been measured before he spoke it aloud. "You do not have to explain yourself," she said quietly after a moment. "I understand charity when I see it." That finally caused the faintest shift in his expression. Not amusement. Something sharper. "This is not charity." Serafina looked at him again. "Then why are you helping me?" Cashin did not answer immediately. Instead he glanced briefly toward the rain sliding down the carriage window beside her. "Tell me something first." "What? Why did you not ask anyone for help?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked once. "I beg your pardon? Your stepmother has been humiliating you for years." His voice remained level. That was obvious within 5 minutes of arriving at the estate. Yet no one in society speaks of Miss Serafina Evercott with outrage. Only absence. "Why?" She stared at him quietly. Nobody had ever asked the question before. Not like that. Not directly. "Because outrage requires someone to notice," she said after a long pause. The lantern above them shifted softly with the movement of the carriage. Cashin's gaze remained fixed on her face. "And no one noticed you?" "No," she answered simply. "That can be useful." The statement surprised her enough to lift her eyes fully toward him. Useful? Invisible people hear things others miss. His expression revealed nothing. They survive differently. Serafina felt something strange move through her chest then. Recognition. Not comfort. Certainly not trust. But recognition. As though he understood parts of her life nobody else had bothered seeing clearly enough to name. The carriage turned sharply onto a quieter street lined with tall iron gates and dark stone mansions. Ravensshire District. Wealth settled heavily over this part of London even in silence. "You speak as though you know something about invisibility," she said before she could stop herself. Cashin's eyes shifted briefly toward the window. "Everyone becomes invisible eventually." The answer sounded older than 34. Serafina studied him carefully now beneath the swaying lantern light. Society described Duke Cashin Valecrest as cold because coldness was the simplest explanation people could understand. Sitting across from him now, she sensed something more dangerous beneath the calm exterior. Discipline. Loneliness sharpened into control. The carriage slowed. Through the rain-streaked glass she caught her first glimpse of Ravensshire House. The mansion rose from the darkness in pale gray stone and towering windows glowing softly against the storm. Iron gates stood open ahead of them. Servants waited beneath the covered entrance with umbrellas already prepared, as though the household had anticipated the Duke's arrival down to the exact minute. Serafina's stomach tightened unexpectedly. She became aware all at once of her damp coat, her worn gloves, the exhaustion beneath her eyes. She did not belong in places like this anymore. Perhaps she never had. The carriage stopped smoothly beneath the entrance canopy. A servant stepped forward immediately to open the door. Warm light spilled inside. Cashin rose first and extended one gloved hand toward her. The gesture was perfectly formal. Nothing intimate about it. Yet Serafina stared at his hand for one suspended second longer than necessary because nobody had offered her help in years without expecting humiliation to follow. Miss Evercott. His voice remained calm. You are safe here. Safe. The word entered her quietly and caused something painful to tighten beneath her ribs. She placed her hand lightly against his and stepped down from the carriage. The servants waiting beneath the entrance lowered their heads respectfully. None of them stared. None of them whispered. The difference unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Inside Ravensshire House, warmth wrapped around her immediately. Marble floors reflected chandelier light across enormous ceilings painted with fading gold details from another century. Fresh cedar and firewood scented the air. Somewhere deeper in the mansion a clock chimed softly. Serafina paused near the entrance without realizing it. The house felt less like a residence and more like controlled silence shaped into architecture. A woman in a dark gray dress approached with composed efficiency, perhaps 50 years old, sharp-eyed, immaculately upright. Your Grace, she said with a slight bow. Mrs. Whitmore, Cashin replied. Prepare the East Guest Suite for Miss Evercott. The woman's eyes moved briefly toward Serafina, not judgmental, assessing. Then she nodded once. Immediately. No surprise, no curiosity. As though the Duke bringing home a disgraced aristocratic daughter in the middle of a storm required no explanation at all. Serafina could not decide whether that made the situation more comforting or more alarming. Miss Evercott, Mrs. Whitmore said calmly. A bath has already been prepared upstairs. Fresh clothing will be brought shortly. Serafina blinked softly. Already. Mrs. Whitmore's expression remained unreadable. His Grace dislikes unnecessary delays. Cashin removed his gloves slowly beside the firelit entrance hall. You will stay here for now. Again, not a suggestion. Not quite an order either. Simply certainty. Serafina opened her mouth to protest politely, then stopped. Because exhaustion had finally reached her bones. Because the storm outside had nowhere else to send her. Because some small dangerous part of her wanted to know why the Duke of Ravensshire looked at her as though he had been expecting her long before tonight. Thank you, she said quietly. Cashin studied her for one unreadable moment beneath the chandelier light. You should rest, he replied. Tomorrow will be less quiet. Serafina did not sleep easily inside Ravensshire House. The bed beneath her felt too soft. The silence felt too large. Even the warmth unsettled her because her body had spent years learning how to rest lightly, prepared for interruption at any hour. She lay awake beneath heavy cream-colored blankets while rain whispered faintly against distant windows and firelight flickered across the unfamiliar ceiling above her. The East Guest Suite was larger than the entire upper floor of the Evercott estate. A sitting room stood beyond carved double doors. Fresh flowers rested near the fireplace. Candles burned low beside shelves lined with leather-bound books. Everything had been prepared with such quiet efficiency that she almost felt as though the house had expected her before she arrived. That thought followed her uneasily into sleep. Morning came gray and cold beyond the tall windows overlooking Ravensshire Square. Serafina woke slowly beneath linen sheets softer than anything she had ever owned and stared for several seconds at the unfamiliar canopy above her bed before memory returned all at once. The storm, the carriage, the Duke standing in the rain outside the Evercott estate looking at her as though he already knew something no one else did. Her stomach tightened instantly. She sat upright too quickly and pressed one hand briefly against her ribs until the dizziness passed. A quiet knock came at the outer door. Miss Evercott? Mrs. Whitmore's composed voice drifted through the suite. Breakfast has been prepared downstairs whenever you are ready. Serafina glanced toward the small clock near the fireplace. 9:15. Panic flickered through her immediately. She had slept late. In the Evercott household, oversleeping by even 15 minutes guaranteed cold stares and cutting remarks through the remainder of the day. She rose quickly before remembering no one here had yet given her reason to fear lateness. The realization slowed her movements strangely. By the time she descended the grand staircase 30 minutes later, Ravensshire House had already settled into its precise morning rhythm. Footmen moved quietly across polished marble floors carrying correspondence and silver trays. Somewhere farther inside the mansion a grandfather clock chimed the half-hour. Serafina kept one hand lightly against the staircase railing while she descended. Her borrowed morning dress, provided overnight by Mrs. Whitmore, fit perfectly despite no measurements ever being taken. Cream-colored wool. Simple. Elegant. The detail unsettled her more than she wished to admit. How had they prepared clothing so quickly? The answer waiting quietly beneath that question disturbed her even more. Someone had anticipated her arrival. At the bottom of the staircase, Mrs. Whitmore stood waiting beside the entrance to the breakfast room. "Good morning, Miss Evercott. I apologize for sleeping so late." Mrs. Whitmore's expression remained perfectly composed. "No apology is necessary." Serafina hesitated before entering the room. "His Grace has already eaten?" "The Duke has been working in his study since 6 o'clock this morning." Of course he had. The breakfast room overlooked the eastern gardens where frost silvered the hedges beneath pale winter sunlight. A fire burned steadily against the far wall. Fresh tea waited beside neatly arranged dishes of eggs, toast, fruit, and marmalade. Serafina paused near the doorway uncertainly. There was enough food here for 4 people. "Please sit," Mrs. Whitmore said. "His Grace instructed the kitchen to prepare whatever you preferred." Serafina looked toward the table again. "I do not think His Grace knows what I prefer." "No," Mrs. Whitmore replied calmly. "But he intended to find out." The answer lingered strangely in the room after the older woman departed. Serafina sat slowly beside the window and folded her hands in her lap before touching any of the food. Outside, gardeners moved quietly through the frozen hedges, while morning light spread across the grounds in pale gold. Everything inside Ravensshire House operated with extraordinary control. No raised voices, no rushed footsteps, no tension hiding beneath forced politeness. The absence of hostility left her strangely unbalanced. She lifted her teacup carefully. Her hands had finally stopped trembling sometime during the night. Halfway through breakfast, footsteps approached the doorway. Serafina looked up automatically. Duke Cassian Vailcrest entered wearing a charcoal coat over a black waistcoat, silver cufflinks glinting briefly beneath the firelight. He looked exactly as he had the previous night. Controlled, precise, entirely awake. She rose instinctively from her chair. "Your Grace." "Miss Evercott." His eyes moved briefly across the untouched portion of her breakfast. "You are eating very little." The observation embarrassed her more than criticism would have. "I was not aware I was being inspected." "You are not." He crossed toward the sideboard and poured coffee with the same measured calm he seemed to apply to every action. "You simply look as though you are preparing to apologize for existing in the room." Heat touched her face unexpectedly. She lowered her eyes toward the teacup in her hands. "Forgive me." "There." Cassian glanced toward her over the rim of his coffee cup. "You did it again." "Did what?" "Apologized unnecessarily." Serafina stared at him quietly. "Most people find it easier when I remain agreeable. Most people are weak." The sentence arrived without emotion. He sat across from her at the long breakfast table while pale winter sunlight stretched across the marble floor between them. Serafina became painfully aware of how alone they were inside the enormous room. "Mrs. Whitmore informed me you began work at 6 this morning," she said carefully after a moment. "I did." "Do you always work such long hours?" "Yes." "Why?" Cassian regarded her over his coffee cup. "Because idle men become dangerous." The answer sounded less theoretical than it should have. Serafina studied him quietly beneath the morning light. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes she had not fully noticed the previous evening. Exhaustion hidden carefully beneath discipline. "And what exactly occupies the Duke of Ravensshire before sunrise?" she asked before caution could stop her. Something unreadable flickered briefly across his expression. "Today." He set the coffee cup down softly. "You." The word entered the silence between them with startling weight. Serafina's fingers tightened unconsciously around her teacup. "I do not understand." "No," he replied calmly. "You do not." He reached beside his chair toward a stack of correspondence resting on the table and selected a folded newspaper before sliding it across the polished surface toward her. "You should see this before the servants attempt to hide it from you." Unease moved immediately through her chest. Serafina unfolded the paper carefully. Her eyes caught the headline near the center of the society page almost instantly. Mysterious midnight departure at Evercott Estate. Witnesses report Duke of Ravensshire escorting unmarried daughter away during storm. Her breathing slowed. Further below, smaller lines sharpened beneath her gaze. Questions surrounding Miss Serafina Evercott's sudden removal from the family residence continue circulating among London society. Sources suggest long-standing domestic tensions within the household. Another line followed. The Duke's involvement remains unexplained. Serafina lowered the newspaper slowly. It has already spread this far? London becomes bored easily. Cashin's voice remained calm. Scandal provides exercise. She stared down at the paper in silence. Shame did not hit first. Fatigue did. Endless fatigue at realizing her humiliation had become public entertainment before sunrise. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "You should not be dragged into gossip because of me." Cashin watched her for a long moment. "Do you truly believe gossip concerns me?" She looked up uncertainly. "Your Grace, people will assume things. People always assume things." He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with that same unnerving precision. "What interests me is why Lenora Evercott appeared terrified the moment she realized I intended to take you with me." Serafina blinked softly. "Terrified?" "Yes." He spoke with absolute certainty. Not angry, not offended, afraid. The realization unsettled her because he was correct. She had seen it too beneath her stepmother's composure. Fear. Brief but unmistakable. Cashin's fingers rested lightly against the arm of his chair. "Tell me something honestly, Miss Evercott." His gaze held hers completely now. "What did your father leave you before he died?" The question hit her hard enough that she forgot to breathe for a second. Because beneath the shock rising through her chest came another realization. Duke Cashin Vailcrest had not rescued her impulsively during a storm. He had arrived at the Evercott estate already searching for something. And somehow, impossibly, that something was connected to her. The question remained suspended between them while pale winter sunlight stretched silently across the breakfast room floor. Serafina stared at Duke Cashin Vailcrest without moving. Her fingers rested lightly against the folded newspaper beside her untouched tea. "Nothing," she answered finally. "My father did not leave me anything." Cashin watched her carefully. "You are certain?" "Yes." The Duke leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable beneath the morning light pouring through the tall windows. "Then either you were lied to," he said calmly, "or someone ensured you never saw the truth." A strange chill moved slowly through Serafina despite the warmth of the room. "I do not understand why this matters to you." Cashin's gaze held hers for one measured second before he reached toward the stack of papers beside him and selected a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark wax. The seal bore the crest of House Vailcrest, a silver raven beneath the crown. "Because your father visited Ravensshire House 3 weeks before his death." Serafina's breath caught softly. "That is impossible." "No," his voice remained calm. "It is documented." He slid the envelope across the table toward her. "Open it." Her hands hesitated briefly before lifting the seal. Inside rested a single folded letter written in dark ink across thick cream paper. The handwriting was unfamiliar at first glance until something inside her tightened unexpectedly. Her father's handwriting had always leaned slightly to the left. Controlled. Precise. Just like this. Serafina unfolded the page slowly. October 11th, 1815. "If anything happens to me, the girl must be protected before Lenora discovers the documents." The line blurred slightly beneath her eyes. She blinked once and forced herself to continue. "I have delayed too long already. Serafina does not know the truth about her inheritance, nor the agreement made before her birth. If I fail to return, the responsibility falls to House Vailcrest." The room became very quiet. Serafina stared down at the paper while her heartbeat slowed into something heavy and uneven beneath her ribs. "This cannot be real," she whispered. Cashin did not interrupt her denial. That unsettled her more than argument would have. She looked back at the signature near the bottom of the page. Edwin Evercott. Her father's name written with unmistakable certainty. Her fingers tightened unconsciously against the paper. "What agreement?" she asked softly. That, Cashin replied, is what I intend to discover. Serafina lowered the letter slowly. You are telling me my father asked you to protect me? Yes. Why would he do that? I do not yet know. The honesty in the answer surprised her. Most powerful men preferred certainty even when lying. Cashin Veilcrest spoke like a man entirely comfortable admitting incomplete information. Then why wait until now? She asked. My father died 7 years ago. Something cold shifted briefly behind his eyes. Because the documents connected to your family disappeared shortly after his death. Serafina stared at him in silence. Disappeared. Removed from the legal archives before I could retrieve them. He rose from his chair then and crossed slowly toward the fire while sunlight caught briefly against the silver cufflinks at his wrists. Until recently, I believed the matter had ended there. What changed? Cashin rested one hand lightly against the mantel. 3 weeks ago, someone attempted to access sealed property records connected to the Evercott estate. Serafina felt the room narrow slightly around the edges. Who? That is still unclear. He turned toward her again. But the timing interests me. Because I was thrown out. Because Lenora Evercott suddenly decided to remove you from the house after allowing you to remain there for years. His gaze sharpened slightly. People rarely discard something unless they fear losing control of it first. Something about the sentence unsettled her deeply. Not because it sounded dramatic. Because it sounded logical. Serafina lowered her eyes toward the letter again. Her father's handwriting seemed almost unreal against the cream-colored paper. For years she had believed his death left nothing behind except an increasingly silent house and a stepmother who treated her presence like an inconvenience. Now the stranger sat across from her speaking about missing records and hidden agreements, as though her life contained secrets she had never even imagined. You think Lenora knows something, she said quietly. I think Lenora is afraid of something. Cashin returned to the table with the same controlled movements that seemed to define him completely. Fear changes behavior. Last night she was not afraid of scandal. She was afraid of losing access to you. Serafina's throat tightened unexpectedly. Access. The word made her feel less like a person and more like a locked room someone had misplaced the key to years ago. I am not an object to be controlled, she said softly before she could stop herself. Silence followed. Not tense. Just still. Cashin regarded her carefully across the breakfast table. No, he said at last. You are not. The answer arrived with such quiet certainty that something inside her chest shifted painfully. She looked away first. Outside the breakfast room windows, pale sunlight spread slowly across the frost-covered gardens. Ravensshire House remained calm around them. Controlled. Distant. Yet beneath that calm she could feel movement beginning somewhere unseen. Like ice cracking quietly beneath deep water. What happens now? She asked after a long pause. Cashin reached for his coffee cup again, though his eyes never fully left her face. Now London watches. Wonderful. The dry response escaped before she could soften it. To her surprise, the corner of his mouth moved almost imperceptibly. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. It vanished quickly enough that she almost thought she imagined it. You dislike society. Society dislikes me first, Serafina replied. I simply learned efficiency. Another silence settled between them, less hostile this time, more observant. Cashin studied her with the same unsettling focus he had carried since the night before. As though every answer she gave confirmed pieces of a puzzle he had already been assembling privately for years. Did your father ever speak of Ravensshire? He asked suddenly. Serafina searched her memory slowly. No, then she hesitated. A faint image surfaced unexpectedly through the fog of years. Her father standing beside the library fire one winter evening while she sat reading quietly near the window. She could not have been older than 10. He had looked toward the snow outside for a very long time before speaking almost absently. If anything ever happens to me, trust the men who arrive quietly. Not the ones who announce themselves loudly. At the time she had not understood the sentence at all. Children rarely questioned strange remarks from distracted parents. There was something, she said slowly. Cashin's attention sharpened instantly. What? Serafina frowned slightly while trying to remember clearly. When I was younger, my father once told me to trust people who arrive quietly. Her voice softened with uncertainty. I thought it was meaningless at the time. Cashin became very still, not visibly tense. Worse, controlled tension, like a man suddenly hearing footsteps he had expected for years. What else did he say? Nothing. She searched his expression carefully now. Does it mean something to you? For the first time since entering Ravensshire House, Cashin looked away before answering. His gaze shifted briefly toward the frost gathering beyond the windows. Possibly. The single word increased her unease immediately. Before she could press further, quick footsteps approached the breakfast room entrance. Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway with unusual urgency restrained carefully beneath her composure. Your Grace. Cashin turned slightly toward her. What is it? There is a visitor requesting immediate audience. Who? Mrs. Whitmore hesitated just long enough for tension to enter the room. Lady Lenora Evercott. Serafina's hand tightened suddenly around the letter in her lap. Across the table, Cashin's expression did not change at all, which somehow felt far more dangerous than anger would have. For one suspended moment, nobody inside the breakfast room moved. Pale winter sunlight rested across the edge of the table. The fire crackled softly against marble. Somewhere deeper inside Ravensshire House, a clock began striking 10. Serafina felt her heartbeat slow heavily beneath her ribs while Mrs. Whitmore waited silently at the doorway. Lenora Evercott had arrived too quickly, too early. That meant fear. Cashin Vailcrest set his coffee cup down with careful precision before rising from his chair. Where is she? The blue drawing room, Your Grace. Mrs. Whitmore's voice remained composed. She insisted the matter was urgent. Cashin adjusted one silver cufflink slowly. Everything becomes urgent once people lose control. Serafina lowered her eyes toward the letter still resting in her hands. Her father's handwriting blurred faintly against the cream paper now. She folded it carefully before speaking. I should leave. The Duke looked at her immediately. No, the answer came without hesitation. Your Grace, this concerns my family. No, he corrected calmly. This concerns why your family suddenly became interested in removing you from public view. Serafina stood slowly from her chair. Lenora will not speak honestly in front of me. Perhaps not. His expression remained unreadable. But dishonest people reveal themselves most clearly when they are uncomfortable. The sentence settled uneasily between them. Serafina glanced toward the tall breakfast room windows where frost still silvered the garden hedges outside. Part of her wanted desperately to avoid another confrontation with her stepmother so soon after the humiliation of the previous night. Another part wanted answers badly enough to remain standing exactly where she was. You already expected this, did you not? She asked quietly. Cashin's gaze held hers for one measured second too long. I suspected she would come. Why? Because people who spend years hiding secrets rarely remain calm once someone else begins asking questions. He crossed toward the doorway with the same deliberate stillness that defined every movement he made. Come with me. Serafina hesitated only briefly before following him from the breakfast room. Ravensshire House remained calm around them as they moved through wide marble corridors lined with oil paintings and tall windows overlooking the winter gardens. Servants passed silently carrying silver trays and stacks of correspondence. None of them stared openly at Serafina, yet she could feel awareness moving quietly through the household already. The Duke had brought an unmarried woman into Ravensshire House during a storm. By now, every servant in London probably knew. They approached the blue drawing room at the western side of the mansion. Serafina slowed instinctively near the doorway when she saw Lenora standing beside the fireplace inside. Her stepmother wore a dark burgundy traveling dress trimmed with black velvet. Perfectly arranged. Perfectly elegant. Yet the strain beneath her composure showed clearly now that Serafina knew to look for it. Lenora's gloved hands remained clasped too tightly together. Her jaw looked rigid beneath the soft firelight. She turned immediately at the sound of approaching footsteps. Relief flashed briefly across her face when she saw Cashin, then vanished the moment she noticed Serafina beside him. Serafina. The name arrived sharp with disbelief. You are still here. Still here. Not are you well. Not did you sleep safely. Serafina felt something inside her settle quietly into certainty. Cashin entered the room first. Lady Evercott. His tone remained perfectly formal. You requested audience. Lenora gathered herself quickly. Yes, I wish to resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding before society invents more scandalous versions of events. Her eyes shifted briefly toward Serafina. I fear my stepdaughter acted impulsively last evening. Serafina almost spoke. Cashin spoke first. Impulsively. The single repeated word carried no visible emotion. Somehow that made it more dangerous. Lenora lifted her chin carefully. Serafina has always been sensitive by nature. Her father indulged that weakness excessively. The statement should not have hurt anymore. Yet Serafina still felt the familiar tightening beneath her ribs. Years of being described rather than understood. Cashin moved slowly toward the fireplace while Lenora continued speaking. Naturally, I regret that household tensions became visible publicly. However, I assure you there was never any intention of cruelty. No? Cashin asked calmly. Removing a woman from her home during a winter storm appears unusually compassionate. Then, Lenora's composure flickered. Only briefly. You misunderstand the situation entirely. Then explain it clearly. Silence touched the room for a moment. Lenora glanced toward Serafina again. Measuring. Calculating. I had reason to believe remaining in the house was becoming emotionally unhealthy for her. Serafina looked at her stepmother quietly. Emotionally unhealthy. Lenora ignored her completely and addressed Cashin instead. Serafina struggles with attachment to things that no longer belong to her. The words landed strangely. Cashin noticed it too. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Interesting phrasing. Lenora's shoulders stiffened. I simply mean she has difficulty accepting change. What exactly no longer belongs to her? The question arrived smoothly. Precisely. Lenora hesitated 1 second too long. Serafina saw it happen. So did Cashin. The estate, Lenora answered finally. Naturally. Naturally, Cashin repeated softly. He turned then toward the windows overlooking the frost-covered gardens beyond Ravensshire House. Tell me something, Lady Evercott. His voice remained calm. When Edwin Evercott died, were all inheritance documents processed immediately? The color drained almost invisibly from Lenora's face. It happened so quickly most people would have missed it entirely. Serafina did not miss it. Neither did Cashin. Of course, Lenora replied. Too quickly. Why would you ask such a strange question? Cashin finally looked back at her. Because I dislike incomplete paperwork. The lie sounded effortless. Lenora's fingers tightened against one another inside her gloves. I assure you there was nothing incomplete regarding my husband's estate. Then you will not object to my reviewing the records. The room became very still. Serafina watched her stepmother carefully now. For the first time in years, Lenora Evercott looked cornered. Your Grace, Lenora said after a measured pause. Surely this matter does not concern House Valecrest. You are inside House Valecrest at this moment. His voice never rose. Everything spoken here concerns me. The sentence settled across the drawing room with quiet force. Serafina felt tension spread slowly beneath her skin. Lenora had spent years controlling every conversation through status, timing, and carefully measured humiliation. None of those methods seemed to work against Cashin Valecrest. He gave her nothing emotional to manipulate. That frightened her. I came only to bring Serafina home, Lenora said finally. The words shocked the room into silence. Serafina stared at her stepmother openly now. Home. Last night Lenora had thrown her into the rain before society guests arrived. This morning she suddenly wished to bring her back. Cashin's expression remained unreadable. How generous! Lenora ignored the quiet mockery beneath his tone. The situation has become unpleasantly public. It would be best for everyone if Serafina returned before further gossip spreads. There it was. Not concern. Reputation. Control. Serafina felt something cold and clear settle fully into place inside her chest. No, she said softly. Both Lenora and Cashin looked toward her immediately. Her hands remained steady at her sides now. I will not return. Lenora's eyes sharpened instantly. Seraphina, you are behaving childishly. No, her voice stayed calm. I am behaving clearly. The older woman stared at her with open disbelief, as though quiet resistance felt more offensive than anger ever could. You do not understand the consequences of this decision, Lenora warned. Society already believes enough terrible things about unmarried women living under strange roofs. Seraphina felt heat rise faintly beneath her skin. Not shame. Anger finally arriving after years of silence. Before she could answer, Cashin stepped smoothly between them. Not dramatically, simply enough to shift the balance of the room completely. Lady Evercott. His tone remained perfectly controlled. Miss Evercott is a guest of Ravensshire House. Lenora looked at him carefully now, truly carefully, and for the first time, Seraphina saw genuine fear enter her stepmother's eyes, because both of them suddenly understood the same thing at once. The Duke of Ravensshire was no longer merely sheltering Seraphina from a storm. He was protecting her, and neither of them yet knew why. Lenora Evercott understood retreat long before she understood defeat. The realization appeared quietly across her face as she stood inside the blue drawing room beneath the steady gaze of Duke Cashin Valecrest. She could not control the conversation anymore. Worse, she could not predict him. That uncertainty unsettled her more than open hostility ever would have. I see, she said finally, smoothing one gloved hand against the front of her burgundy sleeve with precise movements. Then perhaps I have overstayed my welcome. Cashin did not answer immediately. He simply watched her with the same unreadable calm that had slowly transformed the atmosphere of the room since her arrival. Seraphina remained near the windows overlooking the frost-covered gardens, silent and very still. Years ago she would have rushed to ease tension before it hardened further. She would have apologized, softened her tone, tried desperately to make herself smaller so conflict could pass around her harmlessly. This morning she did none of those things. Lenora noticed. The older woman's eyes sharpened briefly toward her stepdaughter. You should think carefully before allowing pride to guide you, she said. Temporary emotions can create permanent consequences. Seraphina met her gaze calmly. I learned that from you. The answer landed softly. That made it worse. Lenora's jaw tightened. Cashin observed the exchange without interruption, though something almost thoughtful moved briefly behind his gray eyes. Very well, Lenora said after a measured pause. If Miss Evercott insists on remaining here, I will not force the matter publicly. Publicly. The word settled heavily inside the room. Cashin heard it too. An interesting distinction, he said calmly. Lenora ignored him and reached instead for the black velvet reticule resting beside the drawing-room chair. There is one final matter. She withdrew a folded cream envelope sealed with dark green wax. A letter arrived this morning addressed to Seraphina. Unease flickered immediately through Seraphina's chest. From whom? No signature. Lenora crossed the room and held out the envelope. Seraphina hesitated before accepting it. The paper felt cold against her fingertips. Her name was written across the front in elegant slanted handwriting she did not recognize. Miss Seraphina Evercott. Ravensshire House. The speed of it disturbed her. Someone already knew where she was staying. Cashin stepped slightly closer. Open it. Seraphina broke the seal carefully. Inside rested a single sheet of paper containing only one sentence. Stop searching for what your father hid. Some truths were buried for a reason. Her breathing slowed. Beneath the message sat no signature. Only a symbol pressed faintly into the corner of the page. A silver crest shaped like a key surrounded by ivy leaves. Cashin's expression changed instantly. Not dramatically. Worse, controlled recognition. What is it? Seraphina asked quietly. He reached for the letter. His fingers brushed hers briefly as he took it. Warm. Steady. His eyes narrowed slightly upon seeing the crest. Where did this arrive from? He asked Lenora. It was delivered to the Evercott estate before sunrise. Lenora's composure appeared genuine now, confused rather than manipulative. I assumed one of Seraphina's acquaintances had learned she left the house. Seraphina has no acquaintances, Cashin said calmly. The bluntness of the statement startled all three of them into brief silence. Then his gaze shifted toward Serafina again. That was not intended as insult. Surprisingly, she almost smiled. Only observation. Yes. His eyes returned to the letter. Which raises the question of who sent this. Serafina studied the strange silver crest again. Do you recognize it? Cashin hesitated. Possibly. Lenora's attention sharpened immediately. What does it mean? It means, Cashin replied quietly, someone else knows the Evercott records still exist. The room grew colder despite the fire burning steadily nearby. Serafina folded her arms lightly against herself without realizing it. You continue speaking as though my life contains secrets everyone understands except me. Cashin looked at her then. Fully. That is precisely what concerns me. The words entered her quietly. For years people had spoken around her rather than to her. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Decisions happened without explanation. Even her father, kind in distant ways yet increasingly distracted before his death, had always looked at her sometimes with an expression she never fully understood. Not guilt exactly. Fear, perhaps, as though time was running out on something he could not explain aloud. Lenora moved toward the doorway at last. I believe this discussion has become unnecessarily dramatic. Cashin folded the anonymous letter carefully. Most dangerous things appear dramatic only after people ignore them too long. The older woman paused near the door. You are making a mistake involving yourself in this matter, Your Grace. Am I? The Evercott estate has survived perfectly well for years without interference. Cashin's expression remained perfectly calm. And yet someone felt compelled to threaten Miss Evercott before noon. Lenora's eyes shifted sharply toward Serafina again. This time something colder lived behind the look. Calculation returning. You truly do not remember anything unusual from your childhood? She asked suddenly. Serafina blinked softly at the abrupt question. What? Your father never told you anything strange? Never gave you documents? Keys? Instructions? The desperation hidden beneath the questions startled her. No, Lenora stared at her for one suspended second too long. Then she seemed to realize how revealing the questions themselves had become. Forget I asked. Cashin moved slightly between them again. Effortless. Protective without appearing dramatic. I doubt Miss Evercott forgets much anymore. Lenora's face hardened fully then, the mask finally slipping enough for Serafina to see the resentment beneath it clearly. You think he is helping you because you matter, she said quietly. You do not understand men like the Duke of Ravensshire at all. Serafina felt the old instinct rise immediately. Stay silent. End the confrontation. Yet something inside her had changed during the past 12 hours. Perhaps because someone finally stood beside her instead of waiting for her to disappear politely from the room. No, Serafina replied softly. I think you are frightened because for the first time I might begin asking questions. The silence afterward felt enormous. Lenora stared at her stepdaughter almost as though seeing her clearly for the first time. Then, without another word, she turned and left the drawing room. The door closed behind her with quiet finality. Serafina exhaled slowly only after the footsteps disappeared down the corridor. Her hands had begun trembling again. She pressed them lightly together to hide it. Cashin noticed anyway. He always noticed. Sit down, he said calmly. You look pale. I am fine. No, his voice remained steady. You are overwhelmed and attempting not to show it. Serafina lowered herself slowly into one of the blue velvet chairs near the fire. The room suddenly felt too warm, too quiet. She knew something, she whispered after a moment, about my father, about those documents. Cashin remained standing beside the fireplace, one hand resting lightly against the marble mantel, while winter sunlight touched the sharp edge of his profile. Yes, and you know more than you are saying. He did not deny it. That frightened her most of all. Your father trusted my family once, he said quietly. Enough to ask for protection. Why? I am still trying to determine that. Serafina looked toward the anonymous letter resting between his fingers. And whoever sent this does not want you to succeed. No, his gray eyes lifted toward her slowly. They do not. Another silence settled between them. Not empty this time. Waiting. Then Cashin crossed toward a narrow writing desk near the windows and unlocked one of the drawers with a small silver key from his pocket. He withdrew an old leather folder tied shut with dark ribbon. Age had worn the edges smooth. Serafina watched his movements carefully. "What is that?" Cashin placed the folder gently upon the table between them. The only surviving file connected to Edwin Evercott's final meeting at Ravensshire House. Her pulse quickened unexpectedly. "You said the records disappeared." "Most of them did." He untied the ribbon slowly. "This one survived because my father hid it separately." Serafina stared at the worn leather folder as though it might suddenly change shape if she looked long enough. "What is inside?" Cashin's gaze remained fixed on the papers beneath his hand. "That," he said quietly, "depends on whether your father was trying to protect your future." His eyes lifted toward hers. "Or hide your identity." The leather folder smelled faintly of cedar and old paper when Cashin untied the dark ribbon completely. Serafina remained seated beside the fire, her hands folded tightly together in her lap, while afternoon light faded slowly across the blue drawing-room windows. Outside, frost still clung to the gardens beyond Ravensshire House. Inside, the air felt increasingly narrow with every secret placed between them. Cashin withdrew the first document carefully. Yellowed paper, precise handwriting, official seals pressed into the corners. "What is it?" Serafina asked quietly. "A property agreement." He scanned the page briefly before continuing. "Signed 25 years ago between House Valecrest and Edwin Evercott." Serafina frowned softly. "My father knew your family that long ago?" "Apparently better than either of us realized." Cashin placed the paper on the table between them. "Your father served briefly as legal advisor to my grandfather before your birth." The information unsettled her immediately because it contradicted everything she believed about her family. Edwin Evercott rarely spoke about his past. He preferred silence to explanation. He never mentioned any connection to Ravensshire. "No." Cashin's gray eyes lifted toward her. "Which suggests the relationship ended badly." He opened another document. This one appeared handwritten rather than official. Serafina watched his expression sharpen almost imperceptibly while reading. "What does it say?" Cashin hesitated. "Not from uncertainty. Calculation." Then he handed her the paper. The handwriting belonged to her father again. Smaller this time, less controlled. "If Lenora discovers the child's true position before the transfer is completed, everything will collapse. The girl must remain outside public attention until the matter is secure." Serafina felt her pulse quicken painfully beneath her ribs. "The child." Her voice sounded distant even to herself. "That is me." Cashin said nothing. He did not need to. She looked down at the paper again. "Outside public attention." The phrase echoed strangely through her memory. Suddenly dozens of moments from childhood rearranged themselves into something colder. Lenora insisting Serafina remain upstairs during important social gatherings. Refusing invitations. Removing her from public photographs. Dismissing expensive tutors after only a few weeks. At the time Serafina assumed resentment explained everything. Now another possibility emerged slowly beneath the surface. Not hatred alone. Concealment. "Transfer," she whispered. "What transfer?" Cashin reached for another folded page near the bottom of the file. This document carried heavier legal seals across the corners. The moment he opened it, his expression changed completely. Still controlled. But underneath that control lived unmistakable recognition. "What is it?" Serafina asked again. He looked at her directly this time. "Your father did not merely leave you an inheritance." The room seemed to still around them. "What do you mean?" Cashin placed the document carefully on the table. "According to this agreement, ownership rights connected to a significant portion of the Evercott estate were intended to transfer to you upon your 25th birthday." Serafina stared at him blankly. "That is impossible." "No." His voice remained calm. "It was hidden." She looked down at the legal document with widening disbelief. Official signatures covered the bottom half of the page. Edwin Evercott. Several legal witnesses. Even the old crest of House Valecrest pressed into red wax near the edge. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. Lenora told me repeatedly the estate passed entirely to her after my father died. Then Lenora lied. Cashin folded the paper slowly. Or she prevented the transfer from being completed. Serafina rose abruptly from the chair and crossed toward the windows because suddenly sitting still felt impossible. Her reflection stared faintly back at her through the pale winter glass. Cream-colored dress, unsteady breathing. A woman whose entire understanding of her life had begun unraveling within a single morning. "Why would my father hide this from me?" she asked quietly. Perhaps he intended to explain later. He never did. The words escaped more sharply than intended. Silence followed. Heavy. Cashin watched her from beside the table without interrupting. "I spent years believing I was unwanted," she continued softly, still staring toward the frost-covered gardens outside. Lenora made certain of that. Her fingers tightened lightly against one another. "Now suddenly everyone behaves as though I am some missing piece in a game I never knew existed." Cashin's gaze remained fixed on her profile, reflected faintly against the window glass. "You are not a game piece." Serafina let out one quiet breath that almost resembled laughter. "You continue saying that while speaking about me like hidden property." The sentence lingered between them. Cashin did not defend himself immediately. That honesty unsettled her more than excuses would have. "You are correct," he said finally. "This situation has involved control for too long." She turned toward him then. "And what exactly do you want from me?" The question entered the room softly, directly. Cashin regarded her for several measured seconds before answering. "The truth." Something about the simplicity of the answer weakened her anger unexpectedly. She looked away first. "I do not even know what the truth is anymore." "Neither do I." His voice remained steady. "But someone went to considerable effort to erase parts of your identity from public record." Identity. The word settled uneasily through her chest. "You keep implying there is something unusual about my birth." Cashin's eyes shifted briefly toward the remaining papers inside the leather folder. "There may be." Serafina felt cold despite the fire burning nearby. "What does that mean?" Before he could answer, another folded item slipped partially free from the bottom of the folder and landed softly against the polished table. A photograph. Old. Faded around the edges. Cashin reached for it first, then stopped halfway. His expression sharpened instantly. "What?" Serafina crossed toward the table before he could respond. The photograph showed 3 people standing beside a stone terrace sometime many years earlier. A younger Edwin Evercott. A dark-haired woman Serafina did not recognize. And beside them stood a man she recognized immediately despite the age of the image. Cashin Vailcrest's father. The former Duke of Ravensshire. Her breathing slowed. "Who is the woman?" Cashin remained very still while studying the photograph. "I do not know." Yet something in his expression suggested otherwise. Serafina looked closer. The unknown woman stood with one hand resting lightly against her stomach beneath a pale traveling coat. Pregnant. A faint handwritten note stretched across the bottom corner of the image. Summer, 1799. Before everything changed. Serafina stared at the sentence. Then at the woman's face again. Dark hair. Gray eyes. A familiar curve near the mouth. Her stomach tightened painfully. "She looks like me." The words came out barely above a whisper. Cashin's eyes lifted toward her immediately. Silence crashed heavily through the room. Serafina picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. The resemblance sharpened the longer she stared. Not identical, but unmistakable. Enough to make her chest tighten with growing dread. "Who is she?" she asked again. Cashin's jaw tightened slightly beneath the fading afternoon light. "If I am correct," he said carefully, "that woman was never supposed to appear in these records at all." The fire crackled softly beside them. Somewhere deep within Ravensshire House, distant footsteps echoed briefly through the corridor before fading again into silence. Serafina lowered her eyes toward the photograph in her hands. For years she believed invisibility meant nothing. Now she was beginning to understand the far more dangerous possibility. Someone had not ignored her existence. Someone had hidden it deliberately. And across the room, Duke Cassian Veilcrest looked at the photograph with the expression of a man realizing a secret buried for decades might finally be returning to life. The photograph remained in Serafina's hands long after the room fell silent again. Afternoon light had begun fading fully beyond the tall windows of the blue drawing room, turning the frost-covered gardens outside into pale shadows beneath a darkening winter sky. She stared at the unknown woman's face while unease spread steadily beneath her ribs. The resemblance refused to disappear no matter how many times she looked away and back again. Gray eyes, dark hair, the same restrained expression that people often mistook for coldness because they did not understand what constant caution looked like on a woman's face. "You recognize her," Serafina said quietly. Cassian remained standing near the table, one hand resting lightly against the worn leather folder. "Not personally. That is not the same thing." His gaze lifted toward her slowly. "No," Serafina folded the photograph carefully between trembling fingers. "Then tell me who she is." Cassian looked toward the fire briefly before answering. Her name was Evelyn Ashcombe. The name meant nothing to Serafina, yet something about the way he spoke it made the room feel colder. Who was she? Officially. He paused slightly. A distant relation connected to several old aristocratic families. And unofficially? Silence stretched between them. Cassian rarely hesitated without reason. "Unofficially," he said at last. "There were rumors she became involved in a political scandal before disappearing from society entirely." Serafina frowned softly. Disappearing. No death records. No public farewell. Nothing. His eyes shifted briefly toward the photograph again. One season she existed. The next she was gone. A strange heaviness settled slowly through Serafina's chest. "And my father knew her." "Yes. As did your father." "Apparently." She looked down again at the handwritten note beneath the image. "Before everything changed." "What changed?" Cassian's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "That," he said quietly, "is what someone has spent 25 years trying to hide." The fire crackled softly between them while Ravensshire House settled into evening silence around the drawing room. Somewhere in the distance, servants prepared lamps throughout the mansion as daylight disappeared fully beyond the windows. Serafina moved slowly toward one of the chairs near the fire and sat again because her legs suddenly felt unsteady beneath her. "I do not understand any of this." Her voice remained calm. Too calm. "Yesterday I believed my life was painfully simple." Cassian watched her carefully. "And today?" She looked down at the photograph resting in her lap. "Today it feels as though everyone else received pieces of a story I was never allowed to read." The words lingered heavily in the room. Cassian crossed slowly toward the fireplace. Firelight sharpened the severe lines of his profile while shadows gathered across the rest of the drawing room. "There is something else," he said after a long pause. Serafina's stomach tightened immediately. "Of course there is." The faintest trace of something almost resembling amusement touched his expression before disappearing again. He reached into the leather folder and withdrew one final sealed envelope. Unlike the others, this one bore no official crest. Only a single handwritten line across the front. "To be opened only if the girl survives beyond 24. Serafina stared at the envelope without breathing for a second. "The girl." Her voice sounded distant. "Me again." "Yes." Cassian held the envelope carefully between his fingers but did not open it immediately. "This was hidden separately inside the file. Why would my father write something like that?" He met her gaze steadily. "Perhaps because he believed you were in danger." The answer entered her quietly and remained there. Not dramatic. Worse. Logical. Suddenly Lenora's behavior through the years felt different when viewed through this new lens. Isolation. Control. Restrictions disguised as propriety. Serafina remembered once asking to attend a summer gathering in Bath at 17. Lenora refused so sharply that even her father looked startled. "You are safer here." At the time the statement felt cruel. Now it returned with unsettling clarity. "Open it," she whispered. Cassian studied the envelope for another moment before breaking the seal carefully. The paper inside appeared older than the others. Folded multiple times. He unfolded it slowly while Serafina watched his face for any visible reaction. There was one. Brief but unmistakable. His jaw tightened. What is it? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he handed her the letter silently. Serafina took it with unsteady fingers. The handwriting belonged to her father again, though shakier this time. If you are reading this, then Serafina has survived long enough for the truth to become unavoidable. I pray she never learns it this way. Her throat tightened painfully. She continued reading. Evelyn Ashcombe was never meant to disappear. She was hidden after the Ashcombe inquiry threatened to expose names powerful enough to destroy entire families. When Evelyn died giving birth, the child became the final remaining evidence. Serafina stopped breathing entirely. The child. Her eyes moved lower across the page. I agreed to raise the girl as my own because the alternative would have condemned her before she could walk. Only 4 men knew the full truth. 2 are dead now. 1 vanished. The last is the heir of House Veilcrest. The room blurred faintly around the edges. Serafina lowered the paper slowly. Across from her, Cashin stood absolutely motionless beside the fire. You knew, she whispered. Not fully. His voice remained calm, though something sharper lived beneath the calm now. My father told me before his death that House Evercott once protected someone important. Nothing more. Serafina looked back at the letter again. Then Edwin Evercott was not my real father. Saying the sentence aloud felt strangely empty. Not heartbreaking, just unreal. No, Cashin answered quietly. She stared toward the fire while years of memory rearranged themselves violently inside her mind. Her father's distant affection. The way he sometimes watched her with grief hidden behind his eyes. The guilt. The secrecy. Even Lenora's resentment suddenly made terrible sense. Not stepdaughter. Intruder. Evidence hidden inside her household for 24 years. Serafina pressed trembling fingers briefly against her forehead. Who was my real father? Cashin's silence answered before his words did. Slowly she lifted her eyes toward him. You know. I suspect. Tell me. Firelight flickered across his gray eyes while tension settled heavily between them. According to the remaining fragments inside the file, he said carefully, Evelyn Ashcombe's disappearance became connected to a political investigation involving several noble families and 1 member of the Royal Advisory Council. Serafina's pulse quickened painfully. That does not answer my question. No, his gaze held hers completely now. It explains why your identity needed to disappear. She rose abruptly from the chair and crossed toward the windows again because suddenly the room felt too small to breathe inside. Snow had begun falling softly beyond the glass now, white against black iron gates. Ravensshire House stood silent around them like a fortress holding secrets too old to survive daylight. All my life, she whispered. People looked at me as though I did not belong anywhere. Her reflection stared faintly back from the dark window. And they were right. Cashin moved toward her then. Not close enough to touch. Just near enough that his presence altered the silence beside her. You belonged exactly where your father placed you. Serafina shook her head once. Out of sight. Alive. The single word stopped her completely. She looked at him then. Really looked at him. Cashin's expression remained controlled but no longer distant. For the first time since entering Ravensshire House, she saw something else beneath the discipline. Concern. Not polite concern. Real concern sharpened by knowledge. He had not wanted her to discover this quickly. There is more you are not saying, she whispered. His eyes darkened slightly. Yes. About me. About what happens if the wrong people realize who you are. Snow continued falling softly outside while the fire crackled behind them. Serafina became aware suddenly of how close he stood now. Close enough that she could see exhaustion hidden beneath his composure. Close enough to notice the faint scar near his right temple she had somehow missed before. Cashin, she said quietly before thinking. The use of his name changed something instantly in the room. His gaze sharpened slightly. Neither of them moved. Am I in danger? She asked. Silence followed. Long enough to become answer itself. Then finally the Duke of Ravensshire spoke with terrifying calm. You already were. The words remained suspended between them long after Cashin spoke them aloud. You already were. Snow drifted silently beyond the tall windows of the blue drawing room while firelight flickered softly across dark wood and polished marble. Serafina stood motionless beside the glass. her pulse uneven beneath the weight of everything that had changed within a single day. Not Edwin Evercott's daughter. Hidden inheritance. Missing records. A dead woman with her face. She should have felt panic. Instead, she felt something colder. Clarity arriving slowly through years of confusion. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. Cashin remained beside her without touching her. Close enough that she could sense the warmth of him in the cold silence surrounding the room. "Not long enough. That is not an answer." His gaze shifted toward the falling snow outside. 3 months ago, I discovered references to a sealed investigation connected to the Ashcombe name. And me. At the time, I did not know you existed. The sentence landed strangely inside her chest. Existed. As though her entire life had unfolded quietly beneath the surface of someone else's unfinished story. "Then why were you at the Evercott estate that night?" Cashin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Because someone began searching for the same records I was investigating." "Lenora." "Possibly." He looked at her again. "Or someone using her household." Serafina folded her arms lightly against herself. "You speak as though there are enemies hidden behind every door." "In matters involving old aristocratic families and political scandals," Cashin replied calmly, "there usually are." The fire cracked softly behind them. Serafina lowered her eyes briefly because exhaustion had begun settling heavily through her bones now. Not physical exhaustion alone. Emotional weight pressing from too many directions at once. Cashin noticed immediately. Of course he did. "Sit down before you fall over." The bluntness of the instruction almost startled a laugh from her. Almost. "I am not fragile." "No," his voice softened slightly. "You are exhausted." The accuracy of the statement weakened something inside her unexpectedly. Serafina crossed slowly back toward the chair near the fireplace and sat without argument this time. Cashin remained standing for another moment before moving toward a side table where a crystal decanter rested beside 2 untouched glasses. He poured water rather than brandy. Another detail she noticed carefully. He returned and handed her one of the glasses without ceremony. "Drink." She accepted it quietly. Their fingers brushed again. Warm. Steady. Dangerous in ways she did not yet fully understand. "Thank you," she murmured. Cashin sat opposite her at last, though tension still lived visibly beneath the calm precision of his posture now. "There is another reason I came to the Evercott estate that evening." Serafina looked up immediately. "Another reason." He reached toward the leather folder still resting on the table between them and withdrew a folded document she had not yet seen. "This arrived anonymously at Ravensshire House 4 days ago." He handed it to her. Serafina unfolded the paper carefully. Her stomach tightened the moment she recognized the sketch attached beneath the written note. It was her. Not a portrait. A surveillance sketch. Detailed enough to identify the exact shape of her face and the dark coat she wore regularly while walking through the Evercott gardens. Below the drawing, one sentence had been written in sharp black ink. "Confirm whether the girl resembles Evelyn before proceeding further." Serafina felt cold spread slowly through her chest. Someone was watching me. Yes. Cashin's expression remained unreadable, which meant whoever reopened the Ashcombe investigation had already begun searching for you. She looked down at the sketch again. The artist had captured her with unsettling precision. Even the guarded expression in her eyes. "Why did you not tell me immediately?" "Because 24 hours ago you believed your greatest problem was an unkind stepmother." His gray eyes held hers steadily. "I preferred not to replace one fear with another until I understood more." Serafina folded the paper slowly. "You keep saying you do not understand enough. Yet you seem to understand more than anyone else. Not enough to trust the wrong people." The answer came instantly. Too instantly. Her gaze sharpened slightly. "You do not trust easily." Something unreadable moved briefly across his face. No, silence settled between them again. Different this time. Less defensive. More aware. Snow continued falling beyond the windows while Ravensshire House dimmed gradually into evening shadows around them. Servants moved quietly somewhere far down the corridor, lighting lamps throughout the mansion. Serafina studied Cashin carefully in the shifting firelight. The scar near his temple. The exhaustion hidden beneath discipline. the strange loneliness surrounding him even inside his own house. Your father told you to protect me. Her voice remained soft. Did he explain why? Cashin looked toward the fire for a long moment before answering. Only once. What did he say? He leaned back slightly in the chair. He said there would come a time when a woman carrying the Ashcombe eyes would need protection from people pretending to offer it. Serafina's throat tightened unexpectedly. Ashcombe eyes. Gray. His gaze lifted toward hers again. Like yours. She looked away first. Not from fear. From the unsettling intensity with which he watched her sometimes. As though every answer created more questions instead of fewer. Did your father know who my real father was? She asked quietly. Cashin hesitated. I believe so. And you? No, he spoke carefully now. But I suspect the answer connects directly to why Evelyn Ashcombe disappeared before your birth. Serafina stared down into the water glass resting between her hands. All this time I thought Lenora hated me simply because I reminded her of another marriage. Her fingers tightened slightly against the crystal. Now I think she looked at me and saw danger. Cashin's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. Probably. You say that very calmly. Panic wastes time. She almost smiled again despite herself. Is that how you survive everything? Usually. Another silence followed. Softer now. Then a knock sounded sharply at the drawing-room door. Both of them looked up immediately. Mrs. Whitmore entered with unusual tension, hidden beneath her composed expression. Your Grace. Cashin rose at once. What happened? A messenger arrived from the legal archives. She held out a sealed envelope. The Evercott property records you requested this morning have been located. Serafina felt immediate relief move through her chest. Finally something concrete. Something provable. But the expression on Mrs. Whitmore's face prevented the relief from lasting long. Cashin noticed too. That is not the entire message. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated briefly. No, Your Grace. She glanced once toward Serafina before continuing carefully. The archive clerk responsible for securing the documents disappeared shortly after sending notice. The room became very still. Cashin took the envelope slowly. Disappeared. According to the messenger, the clerk left the building abruptly less than an hour ago. No explanation. No forwarding instructions. Serafina lowered the water glass carefully onto the table because suddenly her hands no longer felt steady. Cashin broke the archive seal immediately and unfolded the letter inside. His eyes scanned the contents once. Then again more slowly. What is it? Serafina asked. He looked up toward her with an expression she had not yet seen on him before. Real anger hidden beneath absolute control. The records confirm the inheritance transfer was blocked illegally after Edwin Evercott's death. Her pulse quickened. By Lenora? No, his voice turned dangerously quiet. By someone using authority above hers. Snow continued falling silently outside Ravensshire House while tension spread heavily through the drawing room. Serafina felt the world shifting beneath her again. Bigger now. More dangerous than cruel family politics or hidden inheritance disputes. Someone powerful had erased her identity deliberately. Someone influential enough to manipulate legal records for years. Cashin folded the archive letter once before looking directly at her. You asked earlier whether you were in danger. Firelight sharpened the coldness entering his gray eyes now. I believe someone just answered that question for us. Night settled fully over Ravensshire House while snow continued drifting silently beyond the tall windows. Lamps glowed softly throughout the mansion now, casting warm gold across polished corridors and dark marble floors. Yet inside the blue drawing room, warmth no longer reached Serafina at all. She remained seated near the fire with both hands clasped tightly together in her lap while Cashin stood near the windows reading the archive letter for a third time. The silence between them had changed again. Less uncertain now. More dangerous. Who has authority above Lenora? Serafina asked quietly. Cashin folded the document carefully before answering. Very few people. That is not reassuring. No, he crossed slowly back toward the fireplace. It was not intended to be. Serafina looked toward the flames dancing behind the iron grate because staring directly at him had become increasingly difficult tonight. Not because she feared him, because every answer he gave rearranged the foundations beneath her life again. If someone powerful erased my records, she said softly, why leave me alive at all? Cashin's expression darkened slightly. Perhaps they believed obscurity was safer than murder. The bluntness of the sentence chilled her more than the winter storm outside ever could. That is a terrible comfort. Most truths are. Silence followed. Then another thought struck her suddenly. The clerk who disappeared. She lifted her eyes toward him again. Do you think he was taken? Cashin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I think someone realized too late that I had already found the records. Serafina pressed her fingers lightly against her temple because exhaustion was beginning to blur the edges of her thoughts now. Too much information. Too many hidden years collapsing into a single evening. Cashin noticed immediately. He always noticed. Enough for tonight. No, she lowered her hand slowly. I am tired of being protected through ignorance. Something flickered behind his gray eyes then. Respect, perhaps. Very well. He sat opposite her again, leaning slightly forward now with his forearms resting against his knees. The position felt strangely less formal, more honest. There is one name connected repeatedly to the missing records. Serafina waited quietly. Lord Beaumont. The name meant nothing to her. Who is he? Head advisor to the Royal Estate Commission. Cashin's voice remained calm, though tension sharpened beneath it now. For 20 years Beaumont controlled inheritance disputes involving several aristocratic properties. Serafina frowned softly. And he somehow connects to Evelyn Ashcombe. Yes. How? Cashin looked toward the fire briefly before answering. Officially, Beaumont led part of the inquiry surrounding her disappearance. Officially. She repeated the word carefully. You continue separating official truth from actual truth, because powerful men survive by making the difference difficult to detect. The answer settled heavily inside the room. Serafina thought again about the years inside the Evercott estate. All the invisible rules. All the carefully maintained silences. She used to believe cruelty alone explained Lenora's behavior. Now she understood fear had shaped much of it too. Fear of losing control. Fear of discovery. Fear of her. Does Lenora know all of this? She asked quietly. Probably not. Cashin's fingers rested lightly against the arm of the chair. But she knows enough to understand your existence threatens someone. The sentence entered her slowly. Threatens someone. Not because of what she had done. Simply because she existed at all. A strange sadness moved through her chest then. Not dramatic grief. Something quieter. The realization that even her loneliness had been engineered by other people's decisions long before she was old enough to speak. You asked earlier whether I remembered anything unusual from childhood, she said after a long pause. Cashin's attention sharpened instantly. Yes. Serafina looked toward the fire while searching carefully through memory. There was a man. What man? I do not know his name. Her brow furrowed slightly. He visited the estate several times when I was younger. Always late in the evening. Lenora hated him. Cashin leaned forward slightly. Describe him. Tall. Older than my father. Silver hair. She closed her eyes briefly while trying to remember clearly. He carried a cane with a carved wolf's head. Something changed instantly in Cashin's expression. Very slight. Very dangerous. What is it? He became completely still before answering. That cane belonged to Lord Beaumont. Serafina felt cold move sharply through her chest. You are certain? Yes. His voice turned quieter now. He carried it for decades. She stared at him in disbelief. Then Beaumont knew where I was all along. Apparently, the realization hung heavily between them. Serafina remembered suddenly being 12 years old and standing halfway down the library staircase while voices drifted from behind closed doors below. Lenora sounded furious. Her father sounded afraid. And another unfamiliar male voice had said calmly, she must remain invisible until the matter is finished. At the time the sentence meant nothing. Now it returned with terrifying clarity. Cashin. His gaze lifted immediately at the sound of his name again. I think they were waiting for me to turn 25. Why? Because that is when the inheritance transfer activates. She looked down at her trembling hands. If the records remained hidden until then, someone would lose control of the estate. Cashin watched her carefully. You are beginning to understand the structure of it. The words should have felt reassuring. Instead, they made her feel trapped inside a story written long before her birth. A soft knock interrupted the silence again. Mrs. Whitmore entered carrying a silver tray with fresh tea and a sealed black envelope. Her expression remained composed, though concern lingered faintly around her eyes now whenever she looked toward Serafina. Another message arrived, Your Grace. Cashin accepted the envelope immediately. Unlike the previous letters, this one carried no crest at all. Only a single line pressed into the wax seal. For the girl's safety, stop searching. Serafina's stomach tightened. Another threat. Cashin broke the seal without visible reaction and unfolded the paper inside. His expression did not change while reading. Somehow that frightened her more. What does it say? He handed her the letter silently. Serafina took it carefully. The handwriting looked different this time. Sharper. More controlled. You have already exposed her by taking her into Ravensshire House. Lord Beaumont knows where she is now. If you care whether she survives the winter, send the girl away before the Christmas assembly. Serafina read the final line twice. Then a third time. The Christmas assembly, she whispered. Cashin's eyes remained fixed on the fire now. Every major aristocratic family in London attends. Including Beaumont. Yes. A strange silence settled over the room. Snow continued falling outside while the enormous mansion remained calm around them. Unaware that every answer they uncovered seemed only to deepen the danger surrounding her. Serafina folded the anonymous letter slowly. They expect you to hide me. Cashin looked at her then. Directly. Yes. Will you? The question entered the room softer than intended. Not because she feared the answer. Because some dangerous part of her suddenly cared what it would be. Cashin held her gaze for several long seconds while firelight moved across the sharp lines of his face. No, the single word settled through her chest with terrifying force. He rose slowly from the chair afterward and crossed toward the windows overlooking the snow-covered city beyond Ravensshire Square. If Beaumont truly reopened the Ashcombe matter, he said quietly, then hiding you will no longer solve anything. Serafina watched him in silence. Then what will? Cashin turned toward her beneath the dim golden light of the drawing room. His expression remained calm, controlled. Yet beneath the control lived something colder now. Decision. We stop letting other people define who you are. The Christmas assembly arrived beneath falling snow and a sky the color of cold steel. By early evening, Ravensshire House glowed with hundreds of candlelit windows overlooking the white streets of London, while carriage after carriage rolled through the iron gates toward the grand entrance. Footmen moved quickly across the marble steps carrying umbrellas against the storm. Music drifted faintly from inside the ballroom where the most powerful families in England gathered beneath crystal chandeliers and painted ceilings older than memory itself. Serafina stood alone near the mirror inside the east dressing room while Mrs. Whitmore adjusted the final clasp at the back of her silver-gray gown. The fabric shimmered softly beneath candlelight like winter frost over water. Elegant, understated, dangerous in its simplicity because it drew attention to her instead of distracting from her. Serafina barely recognized the woman staring back from the mirror. Her dark hair had been swept upward carefully with silver pins. The shadows beneath her eyes were gone. For the first time in years she looked less like someone hidden from society and more like someone meant to stand inside it. The realization unsettled her deeply. You are pale, Mrs. Whitmore observed quietly. Serafina lowered her eyes toward her gloved hands. I do not think I was designed for evenings like this. No, the older woman's reflection met hers calmly through the mirror. You were designed precisely for evenings like this. That is why certain people spent years preventing them. The words settled softly through the room. Serafina looked toward the windows where snow continued falling beyond Ravensshire Square. What if they are right? She asked after a moment. What if appearing publicly tonight only places more danger around everyone involved? Mrs. Whitmore fastened the final clasp gently before stepping back. His Grace does not make careless decisions. Serafina's throat tightened unexpectedly. That is not what frightens me. The older woman studied her reflection carefully. Then what does? Silence followed. Serafina could not explain it properly even to herself. Somewhere during the past 2 days, Duke Cassian Veilcrest had stopped feeling like a stranger protecting her out of obligation. That change frightened her more than hidden records or anonymous threats. A soft knock interrupted the room before she could answer. One of the younger maids appeared in the doorway. "His Grace is waiting downstairs, Miss Evercott." Serafina inhaled slowly, then nodded once. The grand staircase below shimmered beneath gold candlelight and garlands of winter greenery wrapped carefully around polished banisters. Voices drifted upward from the ballroom beyond. Laughter, music, crystal glasses touching softly together. Society gathered in all its polished cruelty beneath the roof of Ravensshire House tonight. Serafina descended the staircase slowly with one gloved hand resting lightly against the railing. Halfway down, she saw him. Cassian stood near the entrance to the ballroom dressed entirely in black formal evening attire, silver cufflinks catching the candlelight briefly whenever he moved. Powerful men surrounded him speaking in lowered voices. None held his attention. The moment she appeared on the staircase, his eyes lifted immediately toward her. The conversation around him stopped without anyone realizing why. Serafina slowed instinctively beneath the weight of his gaze. Not because it felt inappropriate, because it felt absolute. Cassian crossed toward the staircase before she reached the final step. He said nothing at first. His eyes moved across her face slowly as though confirming something private to himself. "You look frightened," he observed quietly. Serafina managed the faintest trace of dry humor. "That is because I possess functioning instincts." Something almost resembling amusement touched the corner of his mouth before disappearing again. "Good. You should keep them." He offered his arm then, perfectly formal, perfectly controlled. Yet the gesture altered the atmosphere between them instantly. Serafina hesitated only 1 second before placing her hand lightly against his sleeve. Warmth moved unexpectedly through her chest at the contact. "There are nearly 300 guests downstairs," he said calmly while guiding her toward the ballroom entrance. "Most are harmless." "Most?" "Yes." She glanced toward him. "You are remarkably comforting this evening. I find honesty more efficient." The music from the ballroom swelled louder as they approached the entrance. Serafina felt tension gather tightly beneath her ribs again. For years she had spent parties hidden upstairs while other women danced beneath chandeliers and discussed futures she was never meant to possess. Tonight every eye in London society would turn toward her the moment she entered beside the Duke of Ravensshire. Cassian paused just before the ballroom doors opened fully. "One thing before we go inside." Serafina looked up at him. "What?" His gray eyes held hers steadily beneath the candlelight. "No matter what happens tonight, do not lower your eyes for them." The words entered her quietly, deeply. Before she could answer, the ballroom doors opened. Music and light spilled outward immediately. Conversation slowed almost at once across the enormous room as guests began turning toward the entrance. Serafina felt it happen physically. Hundreds of eyes shifting, recognizing, calculating. Duke Cassian Veilcrest entered first with calm, effortless authority. Then Serafina stepped beside him into the ballroom. Silence spread slowly through the crowd like water through glass. Women froze mid-conversation. Men lowered champagne glasses halfway toward silver trays. She heard whispers almost immediately. "That is the Evercott girl. I thought she vanished. Why is she here with Veilcrest?" Someone farther across the ballroom murmured another sentence softly enough that most guests missed it entirely. "Lord Beaumont will not like this." Serafina's pulse quickened. Cassian's expression did not change. Together they moved farther into the ballroom beneath crystal chandeliers blazing against painted ceilings overhead. Nobility parted instinctively around them. Not for her. For him. Yet because he remained beside her, society suddenly had no choice except to acknowledge she existed too. That realization changed the atmosphere more than scandal alone ever could. A woman in dark emerald silk approached carefully near the orchestra platform. Lady Harrow. One of London's most influential hostesses. Serafina recognized her immediately from years of overheard conversations. "Your Grace," Lady Harrow greeted smoothly. Her eyes shifted toward Seraphina with visible curiosity restrained beneath polished manners. And Miss Evercott, what an unexpected delight. Cashin's voice remained perfectly calm. Unexpected things often become memorable. The older woman smiled carefully. Indeed. Yet Seraphina saw the calculation already beginning behind her eyes. Rumors would spread through every ballroom in England by midnight. Before Lady Harrow could continue, movement near the far side of the ballroom drew attention across the crowd. The guests parted instinctively. Seraphina followed their gaze. An older man crossed the marble floor toward them carrying a silver-headed cane carved into the shape of a wolf. Her stomach tightened instantly. Lord Beaumont. Silver hair. Cold blue eyes. Perfect aristocratic posture sharpened by decades of power. He looked exactly like the memory standing at the bottom of her childhood staircase. And the moment his gaze landed on Seraphina, the entire ballroom seemed to still around them. Recognition flashed across his face before discipline buried it again. Too late. Cashin saw it. So did she. Beaumont stopped several feet away. Your Grace. His voice sounded smooth as polished steel. You neglected to mention Ravensshire House would be introducing surprises tonight. Cashin did not move. I was unaware my guest required public approval. Beaumont's eyes shifted slowly toward Seraphina. Careful. Measuring. Not the look of a man seeing a stranger for the first time. The look of someone confronting a ghost returned unexpectedly to life. Miss Evercott, he said quietly. You resemble your mother more than I anticipated. Silence crashed through the ballroom. Seraphina stopped breathing entirely. Around them, guests exchanged confused glances without understanding the true meaning behind the sentence. Cashin's entire posture changed beside her then. Not visibly aggressive. Worse, controlled fury sharpened into stillness. Careful, Beaumont, he said softly. The older man's attention shifted toward him briefly before returning to Seraphina. You deserve answers, child. Seraphina felt the room narrowing around her while hundreds of aristocrats watched without understanding they stood inches away from a secret buried for 25 years. Then give them, she said quietly. Beaumont studied her for one suspended second. Then his eyes darkened with something almost resembling regret. Your real father, he said slowly, was never meant to know you existed. The orchestra had stopped playing entirely now. Across the ballroom, whispers spread rapidly beneath crystal chandeliers and candlelight. Seraphina stood frozen beside Cashin while the world shifted violently beneath her once again. And for the first time since entering Ravensshire House, she saw genuine alarm break through the Duke's perfect control. The silence inside the ballroom felt almost physical after Beaumont's words. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead while 300 members of London society stood frozen beneath them, pretending not to listen and failing completely. Seraphina remained motionless beside Cashin, her pulse uneven beneath the weight of everything collapsing around her at once. Your real father was never meant to know you existed. The sentence echoed through her mind with terrifying clarity. Beaumont watched her carefully across the marble floor. Not with cruelty. Worse, recognition sharpened by old regret. You should not have said that here, Cashin said quietly. The calmness in his voice made several nearby guests step backward instinctively. Beaumont's silver-headed cane rested lightly against the polished floor. The truth has already survived longer than intended. That does not make this the place for it. No, Beaumont's gaze shifted briefly toward the crowd gathering around them. But secrecy created this disaster in the first place. Seraphina looked from one man to the other while whispers spread through the ballroom like smoke. Names drifted between guests in hushed confusion. Ashcombe, Evercott, Ravensshire. Nobody understood the full truth yet. That almost frightened her more. Who was he? She asked finally. Her voice remained softer than intended. Beaumont's expression changed slightly at the question. Something old and tired entered his eyes. A man who should have protected your mother instead of abandoning her to powerful people. Cashin stepped forward immediately. Enough. Beaumont's attention shifted toward him. You think shielding her from reality will help now? I think using her life as public entertainment ends tonight. The force beneath the sentence silenced the remaining whispers closest to them. Seraphina looked at Cashin then. Really looked at him. Beneath the perfect control, she finally saw anger fully alive behind his eyes. Not embarrassment for himself. Not concern over scandal. Fury on her behalf. The realization moved through her chest unexpectedly. Beaumont seemed to notice it too. "You sound remarkably protective for a man who met her less than a week ago," the older man observed quietly. Cashin's expression did not change. "You sound remarkably interested in a woman you helped erase from existence for 24 years. The ballroom became still again. Beaumont exhaled slowly through his nose. "You believe I wanted this? I believe you participated in it." The older man looked briefly toward Serafina. "Your mother trusted the wrong people. Including you?" she asked softly. The question struck harder than accusation would have. Beaumont lowered his eyes for the first time since approaching them. "Yes." Silence followed. Honest silence this time. Serafina felt something inside her settle quietly into place then. Not peace. Understanding. Every person surrounding this secret carried guilt differently. Lenora hid behind cruelty. Beaumont behind authority. Edwin Evercott behind silence. And Cashin. Cashin carried responsibility like armor sharp enough to wound him too. "Tell me the rest," she said. Beaumont looked toward her again. "Your mother became involved with a man connected to the Royal Advisory Council during a political investigation 25 years ago. Was he my father?" "Yes." Serafina's throat tightened painfully. "Did he know about me?" "No." Beaumont's answer came instantly. Evelyn hid the pregnancy after realizing certain families intended to destroy her reputation permanently. "Why?" "Because the child threatened inheritance lines connected to powerful estates." Serafina stared at him without breathing properly. "So I was hidden because my existence embarrassed aristocrats." "No." Beaumont's voice lowered. "Because your existence could have destabilized political alliances worth millions of pounds and several parliamentary positions." The ballroom remained deathly quiet around them. Most guests no longer pretended not to listen. Cashin moved slightly closer beside Serafina, not touching her, protecting the space around her anyway. Beaumont noticed again. "Your father," the older man continued carefully, "was a married member of the Royal Advisory Council. If your birth became public at the time, multiple noble families would have collapsed into scandal." Serafina looked toward the chandeliers overhead because suddenly the room felt too bright, too crowded. "And Evelyn Ashcombe disappeared for protecting me." Beaumont's expression darkened. Evelyn Ashcombe disappeared because powerful men feared consequences more than they valued her life. The truth landed softly, cruelly. Serafina lowered her eyes toward her gloved hands. She had spent years believing she was unwanted because she lacked value. Now she discovered people hid her because she possessed too much of the wrong kind. "Who was he?" she whispered again. Beaumont hesitated this time, long enough that Cashin's expression hardened immediately. "Do not," the Duke said quietly. "She deserves the truth," Beaumont replied. "Not in a ballroom." The ballroom stopped matching the moment you spoke her mother's name aloud. Tension sharpened instantly between the two men. Around them, society watched with open fascination now. Some guests looked horrified, others thrilled. Scandal among aristocracy always became entertainment eventually. Serafina suddenly hated all of them for it. Before Beaumont could answer, movement near the ballroom entrance drew attention across the room. Another guest had arrived late through the snowstorm outside. Tall, distinguished, silver-haired though younger than Beaumont by several years. The moment Serafina saw him, something strange happened inside her chest. Recognition without memory. The man stopped abruptly near the doorway after noticing the silence surrounding the ballroom. Then his eyes found Serafina. Everything changed. Shock crossed his face so openly that nearby guests turned immediately toward him in confusion. Cashin went completely still beside her. Beaumont closed his eyes briefly as though something inevitable had finally arrived. "Too late," he murmured. The newcomer crossed the ballroom slowly now while whispers spread faster through the crowd. Serafina watched him approach with growing unease. Gray eyes, the same shade as hers. The same restrained expression she saw every morning in mirrors. "Who is that?" she asked quietly. No one answered immediately. Then Beaumont spoke with visible exhaustion. "Lord Adrian Ashbourne." Serafina's pulse stumbled painfully. The man stopped several feet away from her beneath the crystal chandeliers. Up close, the resemblance became undeniable. Not dramatic. Worse, subtle similarities impossible to dismiss once seen. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, even the stillness in the way he carried himself. Ashbourne looked at her as though the floor beneath him had disappeared entirely. "Evelyn," he whispered before catching himself. The ballroom seemed to tilt sideways around Serafina. Cashin stepped closer immediately. "Ashbourne." His tone carried warning now, but the older man barely heard him. He remained focused entirely on Serafina. "How old are you?" The question sounded fragile. "Human." Serafina swallowed carefully. 24. Ashbourne closed his eyes briefly. One gloved hand tightened against the silver cane he carried. "Dear God." Silence crashed through the ballroom again. Then slowly, painfully slowly, Serafina understood. Not from Beaumont. Not from documents. From the expression on Lord Adrian Ashbourne's face. Shock. Grief. Recognition arriving 24 years too late. Her voice nearly failed when she finally spoke. "You are my father." Ashbourne looked at her with eyes already breaking beneath the weight of realization. "I never knew," he said quietly. "I swear to you, I never knew." Serafina stared at him while every hidden year of her life rearranged itself completely. Across the ballroom, guests stood frozen beneath chandeliers and winter garlands, witnessing the destruction of a secret old enough to ruin entire families. Yet somehow the only thing she could hear clearly was the sound of Cashin moving closer beside her again. Steady, silent, present. She looked toward him instinctively then. His gaze remained fixed on Ashbourne with cold, controlled intensity. Protective fury still lived beneath the calmness of his expression. And in that moment, surrounded by aristocrats and buried truths, and the father who had never known she existed, Serafina realized something far more dangerous than scandal had already happened to her. The one man powerful enough to destroy everyone in that ballroom had chosen her side long before she understood why.